Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Czakó, and together with Zsolt Demetrovics, we would like to thank this opportunity to contribute to this important conference, connecting researchers, practitioners, policymakers with the aim of creating a safer online environment for young people. Our presentation will fit into today's broader aim of connecting research and practice, and we will present some key findings from 2 systematic reviews we conducted, focusing on the evaluation of existing video gaming and gambling policies worldwide. We live through an era of unprecedented technological change. Digital devices and online platforms are increasingly central in young people's daily lives, and with this comes a set of emerging risks. The focus of today's talk is on online gambling and online video gaming, 2 behaviors whose problematic forms are now recognized in the ICD-11 of the World Health Organization. In terms of scale, past year gambling affects roughly 46% of adults and 18% of adolescents. Gambling disorder has an estimated prevalence of around 1.4%, and it's more common among men and those who gamble online. For gaming, around 80% of teenagers game, while gaming disorder is estimated to be around 3%, again, disproportionately affecting young people, being 2.5 times more common among men. However, harms are experienced also below the clinical threshold by people who do not meet the diagnostic criteria. One of the most important trends we are observing is that the line between gaming and gambling is becoming increasingly blurred. Loot boxes in video games where players pay for randomized rewards mirror gambling mechanics. Conversely, many gambling platforms are borrowing design features from video games to make their products more engaging. Young people are particularly vulnerable. They are exposed to gambling through advertising and sponsorship, social media influencers who might normalize gambling. They encounter these gambling-like features in games, and there is a risk that engaging with these in-game elements can serve as a pathway to actual gambling. Additionally, although gambling is prohibited for minors, unregulated gambling sites are easily accessible. And both gaming and gambling platforms are designed to be immersive, using techniques specifically intended to keep users engaged. Addressing these risks requires a comprehensive and coordinated approach, requires research, regulation, prevention, and treatment to work together. Giving a brief overview of the regulatory landscape starting with online gambling, there are broadly 3 models that countries used. The first one is prohibition, banning online gambling outright, relying on criminal law and domain blocking. The second is a monopoly or limited exclusivity model, where a state-owned or a single license operator runs gambling services. This is justified through public interest and harm reduction goals. The third one is a licensing or regulated market model, where multiple private operators may obtain licenses, which are subject to strict conditions such as certifications and the requirement to implement so-called responsible gambling measures. In regulated environments, which is around 80% of the countries, good practices typically include age restrictions, usually under 18 or 21, responsible gambling strategies including self-exclusion, deposit limits, advertising restrictions to protect minors, and blocking illegal operators. However, the reality of implementation is more complex, and there is a quickly changing digital environment causing significant changes, which brings me to our research. The picture for online gaming is even more fragmented. Unlike gambling, there is generally no unified legal framework, and video gaming is addressed typically through media law, consumer protection laws, communication regulations, gambling law, and data privacy laws. We see measures such as bans or regulations on gaming time, for example in China or earlier in South Korea, age rating systems, including advised age ranges like the PEGI in Europe or the ESRB in North America. And there is also growing attention toward gambling-like features such as loot boxes. The challenges here are distinct. First of all, restrictions for gaming need to be balanced with the recognition that gaming is, for most young people, a leisure activity with real benefits. There is also the blurring lines with gambling through, for example, skins gambling and random reward mechanisms such as loot boxes, a lack of regulation of risky game features such as addictive design elements, and there's also the problem of a lack of corporate accountability, where the responsibility for preventing harm is too often shifted into the individual gamers and the parents of young gamers rather than the platforms that design these mechanisms. To explore these questions and the evaluation of existing regulations systematically, we conducted 2 systematic reviews of the scientific literature, one on gambling policies and one on gaming policies. Both focused on policies relevant to young people. We searched 3 major scientific databases, Web of Science, Scopus, and PubMed, and included empirical papers that actually evaluated policies, legislations, or regulations, while we excluded those papers that merely describe policies without assessing in some way their impact. This slide shows the Prisma flow diagram, a standard reporting tool for systematic reviews, and summarizes our search and selection process, which resulted in 36 gambling papers and 43 gaming papers included in the final analysis. Among the 36 gambling papers, 88.9% focused on Western countries. The most common topics were the consequences of legalization, accounting for about 44% of the papers, followed by responsible gambling features, with the remainder covered advertising restrictions, prohibition policies, and in-play betting bans. Starting with prohibition. The evidence is quite clear that prohibition measures are difficult to enforce, with people easily circumventing restrictions, even in those countries where gambling is otherwise legal. For example, in Australia, about half of people who gamble legally also use unlicensed sites, and this is especially true among young people. In France, similar patterns were observed. Prohibition of specific products, like online in-play betting in Australia, is similarly challenging. Around 17% of Australian bettors continue to place in-play bets through alternative means, with higher associated risk of harm. Legalization, which is now a global trend in some form, increases gambling participation and also harms. However, it can help to channel new users to regulated, safer operators. It fails to redirect existing users away from offshore sites. A study from Quebec found that 82% of people who were already gambling illegally simply continued to do so after legalization. Legalization can also expand the reach of gambling to new populations. In Spain, it was experienced that the number of people seeking treatment for gambling disorder increased following the legalization of online gambling. The term responsible gambling covers a range of different measures, from warning messages, deposit limits, self-exclusion schemes. Investigations point out that while operators generally formally comply with the requirements, the presentation of these tools often lacks visibility and accessibility. For example, in the UK, mandatory risk warnings were found to exist, but presented in a way that was not visually prominent. Furthermore, having multiple operators with no national overview of accounts makes the application of these measures challenging. In Sweden, where a weekly deposit limit was introduced during COVID, its effectiveness was found to be undermined because players could very simply switch between multiple operators once reaching the limit at one operator. Another central problem with responsible gambling measures is that they are many times voluntary, and the burden falls on the individual player, not on the operator, and many people simply don't use them. For youth, specifically, policies tend to focus on age restrictions, and while these matter, they are simply not sufficient. Young people, unfortunately, regularly access unregulated gambling sites despite minimum age requirements. Regarding advertising, there is some regulation in many countries, but their scope is sometimes limited. Most restrictions focus on the protection of minors, but exposure through sports sponsorship, public outdoor advertising, and social media remains significant. One of the most important findings from this gambling review was that many policies have never been empirically evaluated. We do not know which regulations actually work, and there is an urgent need for more independent research to build the evidence base. Turning to the video gaming review, 43 papers were included, and unlike the gambling review, these were more geographically diverse. About 35% of the papers were from Asia and 23% each from international samples in Europe. The most common topics included the regulation of loot boxes and in-game purchases, followed by the age rating systems. Age rating systems like PEGI are widely adopted and clearly have benefits. However, the evidence also reveals limitations. Their accuracy is questions. For example, PEGI has 5 age categories, but there is no independent assessment of whether these categories reliably reflect the actual risk of games. The ratings are advisory in most countries and carry no legal force. 25% of German adolescents report playing games with inappropriate age ratings, and in Spain, 32% of adolescents do not follow PEGI guidance. Furthermore, parents often do not enforce them either. Thus, at its present form, the age rating system has limited protective value. One of the frequently discussed policy interventions has been gameplay time restriction, most famously in China and South Korea, where governments impose limits on how long young people could play. The evidence regarding these measures was unambiguous. These measures were found to be generally ineffective and easily circumvented. In China, a minority of children engaged in more non-screen activities, but most either circumvented the restrictions or shifted from gaming to other screen-based activities. In South Korea, a law which used to ban gaming for those under 16 after midnight showed an insignificant reduction in internet usage, which was less than 5 minutes per day. South Korea ultimately abolished this law and shifted to a model of voluntary parental control. The regulation of in-game purchases involving randomization, for example loot boxes, is a critical and rapidly evolving area. However, the overall finding is that compliance is generally poor. In China, a requirement to disclose loot box odds resulted only in a surface-level compliance, with information being very hard to find for users. In the UK, despite regulations, only 7% of social media advertisements for video games discloses the presence of loot boxes. In Belgium, which introduced a general ban on loot boxes, 80% of iPhone games, which are available in the country, still sold them, and players can also very easily circumvent this ban by changing their country setting or using a VPN. However, there are some new developments in this topic. In March this year, PEGI announced that they will require games containing paid random items to receive a minimum age rating of 16. I also want to highlight skins gambling, using cosmetic in-game items as virtual currency for gambling, which is a largely unregulated globally. According to a recently published rapid evidence review in the UK, there are 50 known skins gambling sites with 7 million user visits per month, and children as young as from 11 to 14 are also using these sites, twice as likely than young adults. It's associated with harm and may serve as a gateway to conventional gambling, but it falls outside the existing definitions of gambling, meaning it exists in a regulatory blind spot and introduces gambling to a very young age group. Our review points to the need of greater governmental intervention in online gaming. Industry self-regulation raises concerns. There are inherent conflicts of interest when the industry is regulating itself. Our review also flags some wider harmful and criminal behaviors that are facilitated through gaming platforms such as cyberbullying, online aggression, radicalization, and grooming. Existing legal frameworks unfortunately struggle to address these issues in the gaming context. Similarly to gambling, compliance, enforcement, and efficacy of many regulatory measures remains mostly untested and necessitates the further dedicated research and funding alongside the continuous monitoring of both new regulations and new technological developments. At the end of my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that this work, the systematic review, was conducted as part of the Council of Europe's Pompidou Group project. And I would also like to sincerely thank our co-authors Leon Xiao, Callum Deary, Connor Heath, Orsolya Király, and Daniel King. This was a very short presentation of our results, but further information and more country-specific details are available in the systematic reviews. The gambling one has just been published and the other one is currently under review. You can find the references on this side, and if you have any questions, you can also reach us at our email addresses also on the slide. Thank you very much for your attention.